from the YWCA of Rock County is another co-sponsor, and Beth Talon, who is representing Community Action of Rock and Walworth counties, and they're the third sponsor of this. We are, I want to start with the 4 agreements of courageous conversations about race. One is stay engaged. 2 is experience discomfort. It will happen. 3 is speak your truth. And 4 is expect and accept non-closure. We're not going to solve everything tonight. We're talking, and hopefully we're moving steps in the right direction. The conversation tonight will be recorded and available on the Community Actions YouTube channel. Some of that may be recorded and used by media outlets. At the end of the program, our partner members will give announcements, and all other participants are welcome.
Lost you, Neil.
Yeah, my finger touched the wrong place. At 7 o'clock, we will stop recording and move to the parking lot for unmoderated discussion, whoever wants to do it. And the last thing I want to say is that we are going to show a couple of media clips about justice and policing. One is a Democratic clip and one is a Republican clip. I want to remind you all that neither DAT nor the YWCA nor Community Action is a partisan organization. We are nonpartisan, but we do talk about political things, which is not the same at all. So with that, anything else, Amy, I should say?
Just to give a disclaimer that in the first video clip that there is profanity on one of the protest signs. So I know that since a lot of us are spending a lot of time together at home, if your children are watching with you, I just wanted to make you aware of that. It's profanity on a protest sign in the first video clip that we'll watch. I think that's it. I think you did a great job of covering everything else, Neil. I have some links to the 2 bills that we'll be discussing. But the way Zoom works is that if a link is put in the chat before you arrive, you won't be able to access that information. So I'm going to put those links in closer to the end of our conversation. So please look for those there. If you are interested in saving the chat, if you click on chat at the bottom, and then once you do that, a rectangle will appear on the side. There are 3 dots there, and if you click on that, you can save the chat. So that's a way to pull information. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I have 2 video clips that I will show. As Neil said, the first one is for the Republican-supported George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And then the second is for the Republican-sponsored Justice Act. So I'll go ahead and play both of those.
Well, we can look up there, but for some reason the audio is not going up there.
Please remember to mute yourself.
No justice! No peace! No racism! Say his name! Say your name! No justice!
Wake of the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor earlier this year, the United States is facing a long overdue moment of national reckoning with police violence in Black communities. Hundreds of thousands of Americans in all 50 states have taken to the streets to demand real change. They've turned this moment into a turning point, and the Congressional Black Caucus and Congressional Democrats are responding with the Justice in Policing Act. Before we dive into the legislation, we have to acknowledge that this bill alone will not solve all the deep-rooted systemic issues with law enforcement. It will have to be matched on the state and local level. However, this bill is a good step toward ensuring all Americans receive true justice, not just some Americans. So let's get into what the bill includes. First, police accountability. It is notoriously difficult to hold police accountable in civil court because of the blanket legal protections they receive. The Justice in Policing Act would dismantle these systems that limit police accountability by funding grant programs for independent investigations into police misconduct and eliminating qualified immunity, which has long made it difficult for people whose rights have been violated by law enforcement to collect any damages at all. Second, data transparency. This bill creates a national registry of police misconduct, which prevents officers who are fired for use of force violations from being able to get a new job on another police department. It also mandates that police departments report data on use of force violations and all investigatory matters based on age, race, religion, and gender. This way, the Congress and the public have the power to hold police departments accountable for discriminatory practices. Lastly, this bill offers sweeping changes to use of force and police culture. It outright bans chokeholds, karate holds, and no-knock warrants at the federal level, and conditions any federal funding to the state and local level on their banning these practices too. The bill further seeks to reimagine how we think about public safety by prioritizing investments in community-led organizations that develop just, concrete, and equitable solutions outside of traditional policing. This bill represents a real shift in how we think about law enforcement entirely. This is just the start when it comes to both the provisions in the bill and how much further we need to go. If you'd like to learn more about the Justice in Policing Act, please visit judiciary.house.gov. Thank you, stay safe, and let's keep moving forward together.
Start by simply saying that too often we're having a discussion in this nation about, are you supporting the law enforcement community, or are you supporting communities of color? This is a false binary choice. The answer to the question of which side do you support, it's I support America. And if you support America, you support restoring the confidence that communities of color have in institutions of authority. If you support America, that means you know that the overwhelming number of officers in this nation want to do their job, go home to their family. It is not a binary choice. This legislation encompasses that spirit. It speaks to the fact that we believe that the overwhelming number of officers in this nation are good people, working hard, trying to keep order in the communities. Communities of color and people like myself, I've told my story several times, stopped 7 times in 1 year. That has been said a lot, but I was stopped this year driving while black when I got a warning ticket for failing to use my turn signal earlier in my lane change. And so this issue continues, and that's why it's so important for us to say that we hear you. We're listening to your concerns. The George Floyd incident certainly accelerated this conversation. We find ourselves at a place with a package that I think speaks to the families that I spoke with yesterday who lost loved ones. We hear you. I think this package speaks very clearly to the young person who's concerned when he's stopped by the law enforcement officers. We see you. And so what does this package do? 3 major areas. One is on the area we have to have the right information so that we can direct our resources as a federal government to making sure that the outcomes lead to safer officers and safer suspects in the instances of challenges. That data collection or the information is around making sure that when serious bodily injury occurs or death, that all that information is reported to the FBI. Today, only 40% of the departments report that information to the FBI. We want all that information because when we hear about the Breonna Taylor case in Louisville, Kentucky, we don't have any information around no-knock warrants. So for us to start a conversation with banning no-knocks doesn't sound like a solid position based on any data because we don't have that data. Once we have the information, we can then turn to the training that is necessary to de-escalate situations, the duty to intervene, not standing there watching an officer with his knee on the neck, but intervening in those situations. We can train our officers better. We can find ways and mechanisms to de-escalate the situation. So we spend a lot of time in the training aspect, using the resources of our grants to reduce the situations and violence in those situations. And then finally, we look at officer misconduct and the necessity of transparency. We believe that the preservation of records on the local level so that departments within the states have a chance to see, almost like a reference check, what the past history of complaints have been against that officer. We do not create a national database. The president's executive order creates basically a national database for that information to flow into. We believe that our policy positions are one that brings the communities of color into a position of stronger understanding and confidence in institutions of authority. And we believe that it brings our law enforcement community to a place where they have the resources necessary to de-escalate some of these situations. And frankly, through James Langford's work on this package, we bring in the opportunity to hire more officers and have more training and have a better perspective on the history.
Even before George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Senator Scott has made it possible for those of us in the Senate Republican Conference who are not African American to understand that this problem still exists. We learned about his being stopped on numerous occasions well before the events of this year. But the witnessing of the murder of George Floyd and the experience in my hometown of Breonna Taylor certainly brings to the forefront this issue for all Americans, including Senate Republicans. My role as the leader, as you know, is to decide what we're going to do. Floor time is the coin of the realm in the Senate because it does take a while to do almost anything. So what I'm announcing today is after we do 2 circuit judges who are queued up either this week or early next week, we're going to turn to the Scott bill. I'm going to file cloture on the motion to proceed. And our Democratic friends, if they want to make a law and not just try to make a point, I hope they'll join us in getting on the bill and trying to move forward.
The fact that some people enjoy talking about systemic racism, the fact that some people want to define everything from a racist perspective, and we don't spend time on the definition of a word, but we spend time on the definition of the problem and the definition of the solution. When there's an overlap of 70–75%, when you start, you're in the right place. So I don't know how to tell people that the nation is not racist. I'll try again. We're not a racist country. We deal with racism because there's racism in the country. Both are mutually true. They're both true, not mutually exclusive. So I don't worry about the definitions that people want to use. It's good for headlines, but it's really bad for policy. We're going to focus on getting something done. Thank you.
Okay, so the way the first part of the evening will go is I have a graphic that Beth Talon from Community Action created for us that is going to give us a breakdown of where our local law enforcement stands on several different positions. So I will put up the graphic and Beth will briefly walk us through it. She is the amazing creator behind the infographic. And then Neil will introduce our local law enforcement professionals that have agreed to be with us tonight. And then I will ask them several questions that they've received earlier. If everyone could mute themselves, that would be great. And then we'll go through each question, and then I will open the floor for everyone present to kind of respond or provide feedback. So as Beth prepares, I will get the infographic up.
Right. Well, I am exceptionally happy to be here because at about 5:28, I didn't have internet access and I couldn't even log in on my phone. So I'm very glad that our internet came back up and we're able to make this happen. So I also want to make sure, I know Neil had the disclaimer. I was able to join when he was doing the disclaimer about how we are bipartisan or nonpartisan organizations. And actually, Community Action recently had to make the distinction due to one of our funders. We're not just nonpartisan, we're apolitical. So with our community service block grant funding, we're actually not even allowed to tell people to register to vote, which is interesting. But I just want to make sure that you know that my role here is collecting information and sending out a questionnaire to law enforcement, and then also putting the results in this graphic. So we had 11 questions, and obviously they're not all in this graphic because some of them were pretty complicated because it's a complicated issue. And I appreciate the thoughtful responses we got. We got them from Captain Sales from Beloit PD, Chief Moore from Janesville PD, Chief Marquardt from Milton PD, and Sheriff Knutson. So thank you very much for taking the time to respond to that. I know it was hard. I was asking you to do a favor to join us here, and then I also said, by the way, can you fill out this homework ahead of time? So I also have a bigger spreadsheet, and I have a list of the full answers that we are going to be able to make available afterwards. So one of the questions, the first question was, what training or guidance has your staff received concerning racial and religious profiling, and is this ongoing? So as you can see, Beloit PD, Janesville PD, they both have implicit bias training. And Janesville PD says they have on-staff implicit bias trainers, and all employees are also attending the citywide diversity training every other year. City of Milton PD, the reason why I mentioned the Janesville trainers is that Milton uses the trainers from Janesville, and they have presented a couple of sessions there, and that's the fair and impartial policing. And then the Rock County Sheriff's Office has diversity training. So I don't know if you want me to pause after each question or if we want to just discuss. What would you like, Amy?
I think if you keep going and just present the infographic, then I'll take it down and then we can get into the details when the questions are posed to local law enforcement.
Rock and roll. All right, the second question we had, are chokeholds allowed in your jurisdiction? No, no unless deadly force is authorized, no unless deadly force is authorized, and then the Rock County Sheriff's Office said no. So of interest, I think in City of Beloit and the Rock County Sheriff's Office, both very emphatically, City of Beloit, Captain Sales said, in any fashion, the use of choke or stranglehold as a compliance alternative is not authorized. And in the Rock County Sheriff's Office, Sheriff Knutson says they are not taught or trained. But City of Janesville and City of Milton generally know, but if deadly force is authorized. So that's a distinction between the departments that I thought was interesting. Are no-knock warrants allowed in your jurisdiction? Apparently they're very, very rare. Each person responding did mention that they might have heard of them once in the past decade, but they haven't actually witnessed them themselves. And the sheriff said that it's possible to get them, but staff only remember about 2 being written in the past 10 years. And neither of those that were written as no-knock warrants in the past 10 years were served as no-knocks, but they were announced prior to entry. We did have a few other questions in between, but then we have what is your position on eliminating qualified immunity? And they all basically had very similar responses and some very thoughtful responses too. And this is one of the ones where I felt like maybe we could use an asterisk, maybe we could use a little bit more information. But, you know, again, this being a Zoom call and not being able to see like a full response written out on the screen, I didn't know how helpful that would be. So so let's see. So basically you can see no, but Milton might reassess it. And no. Does your department have body cameras? Yes. And the Rock County Sheriff's Office is hopeful to receive them, and if not, could pursue other ways of funding those. And the final one, this was the final question in the 11-question questionnaire. How does funding affect your department? Obviously, it's budget season for a lot of municipalities, and funding is often a question. So in Beloit specifically, budget cuts would limit training. In Janesville specifically, budget cuts would limit staffing. So it's interesting seeing where it would limit training and it would limit staffing. Milton, both. Training and competitive wages. And the sheriff is very resourceful, and he says many projects can be done with little funding, but we also have larger needs. Ask me about the jail, he says. So that is a very quick overview. And again, I understand this is simplifying it quite a bit, but we wanted to have a discussion starter for the conversation.
Beth, thank you so much. Next, we will have Neil introduce our local law enforcement representatives that are present tonight. And then I will begin posing each question first to local law enforcement and then requesting that our audience join in. Neil, please. Neil, you're muted.
Can't find my picture to, now I'm unmuted. Thank you. Okay, we have Michael Schultz from Clinton, David Moore from Janesville, Troy Knutson from the Sheriff's Department, Scott Marquardt from Clinton, and Andre Sales from Beloit.
Perfect. Thank you, Neil, and thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Everyone does not have to respond to every question, but if there is something that you would like to add before we open the question up for discussion among the group, please chime in and add that. That's to our law enforcement professionals. And thank you again for joining us. Our first question, what training or guidance has your staff received concerning racial and religious profiling, and is this ongoing? So if there is something that you want to add other than what was included in the infographic, we would love to hear that information at this point.
Amy Chief Moore here. One thing I did not add is our procedural justice training. We have trainers on the Department for Procedural Justice, and that is a very important piece when it comes to profiling type training. And its essence is that we should be transparent with our operations. When we are involved with people out in the field, we should explain why we're doing what we're doing, even if we have to stop and after the incident is over, go back and make sure that people understand why we're doing certain things. It is pretty involved. It starts with assuring that as an administrator, I'm treating my employees with proper justice and proper respect, because why would I expect my employees to treat citizens with respect if I don't treat my employees with respect? And so it's a pretty involved process, but we've had the entire department trained, with the exception of a couple of people I just hired. We need to go back and see that that's in place, but we have trainers on staff, and that's part of the culture here.
Thank you so much, David Moore. Is there anyone from law enforcement that would like to respond to that question before we open it up to our audience?
Well, I'll just say quickly that I asked Dave for help a lot. I don't have any trainers on staff for those kinds of programs, but grateful for the support he's given us in the past in providing trainers for us and covering some of these topics. So we will, as law enforcement, work together on these issues too, and not just alone and in isolation.
Good to know. Thank you so much. Is there anyone from the audience? I will repeat the question again. If you have any comments or specific questions that you would like to share. Since there are so many of us, I do have my chat open. So if you just want to throw a question mark in the chat, if your question is brief, and then I can call on you and you can ask that question, or if you want to type it out, if you put it there, I will read it. Again, the question is, what training or guidance has your staff received concerning racial or religious profiling, and is this ongoing? So from our audience, are there any questions or comments concerning that? Okay, we will move on to question 2. And Beth, if you can back me up on that chat, make sure I don't miss anyone. The second question that we'll pose to law enforcement is, are chokeholds allowed in your jurisdiction? And from that infographic, we saw—
Amy, we might want to pause. We're getting a sudden flurry of questions about training.
Perfect, thank you.
Uh-huh.
All right, here we go. Ashley Morse, if you would like to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, thanks. On the for the departments that had concerns about how budget cuts might affect training, I guess what percentage of your budget now is allocated towards training? And also for the programs you use, is there like a specific program you're partnering or teaching, and is that something that you'd be willing to make public?
Thank you. Anyone from law enforcement would like to answer that?
Well, I will say for the city of Milton, our training budget is very, very small in comparison to our total overall budget. Especially in policing agencies, it's not unusual to have the vast majority of our budget is in our personnel costs. And I believe my training budget for this last year for the entire department for all of the training that we do is $5,000. That $5,000, we try to be very judicious in how we spend it. And we be, we're thrifty and trying not to touch those dollars by, as I mentioned before, finding a trainer locally that's willing to come and do us a favor. Hopefully not doing it on much overtime, and trying to save the dollars that we can, because we don't receive a lot of training dollars, just that, we can't send people away for days at a time. So we have to be careful with how we spend those dollars.
Thank you so much for your transparency on that. A couple questions in the chat. I'm going to try to combine a couple of them and then ask for a response. Is the training a one-time event or ongoing? And then the second part is, are the trainers a diverse group? So anyone from law enforcement that would like to respond to those questions, that would be great.
City of Beloit Police Department conducted implicit bias training in 2017. Since that time, we've hired probably about 10 people. So we looked at it where we would like to conduct our implicit bias training every 2 to 3 years. So actually coming up this January, we will be having our implicit bias training again from Dr. Brian T. Marks out of Morehouse College in Atlanta. He did a very good job for us the first time. We were looking to get some of our officers and sergeants trained to be implicit bias instructors. But with the COVID, our budget kind of took a hit, and then it's going to take another hit next year. So it's something that we do have earmarked for some time when we get back up full strength in our budget to get implicit bias trainers here. We're looking at ways to try to do that. I'm not a big send a person to a virtual training. I want them there so they can understand it, they can ask the questions, and they can have the face-to-face conversations with the instructors. So it's something that we're looking at, but right now we go probably every 2 to 3 years with our implicit bias training, and we do in-house training because we have a common training day every Wednesday with our 10-hour schedule.
Thank you so much. Another question that was submitted, what training does your department receive in nonviolent communication? If any.
I can weigh in on this. And I think we're talking about de-escalation of force, and a big part of the de-escalation of force is the communication that officers have, starting right with their presence on to building relationships and how that interaction goes. Back in 2016, I asked my officers to go out, a group of officers, and find the best de-escalation training that they could find in the nation. I said that you find it and we'll send you there, we'll get you trained up, and I want you to bring it back to our department. About the same time, the Police Executive Research Forum, PERF, if you Google them, they are the think tank and forward-leaning for law enforcement. They came out with the ICAT training, and we sent our officers down to New Orleans, a whole cross-section of the department, a team, and we brought that training back. And once they got back with the, and it's called Integration, Communication, and Tactics is what the ICAT stands for, but it's de-escalation training. They brought it back and I said, that's fine, but I want to see a 3-year plan, because I don't want to have just 1 year of a certain type of training, but to have that continuation of training. So they built a 3-year plan. It actually caught some national attention for others to follow. And we completed the 3-year plan last year. And I said, that's fine. Now I want to see year 4. So we're implementing year 4 of the de-escalation training.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chief Moore. A couple questions I'm going to attempt to combine. The first part is, how does accreditation/state guidance help or hinder adjusting policies? And then the second part that I'd like to add on to that is, what barriers are there to more partnering taking place between local municipalities and offering training to reduce costs?
Well, I'll take the accreditation one as one of the accredited agencies on the call. Accreditation is it's a voluntary status. It's not required to participate in accreditation, but it's a commitment to follow the best practices that have been identified within our state, because it's a state accreditation agency. Those standards in large part, again, are best practices, but when it comes to use of force policy and some of those topics that we're talking about tonight, it's already required by state law. So there's actual legislation that requires us to do certain things. And then accreditation, the process actually backs that up to make sure that not only do we follow the other 200 plus standards, but we're also covering the ones that are also already in state law. So I don't see a barrier per se in the accreditation process. I think it just helps add more to more showing our emphasis on how we're going to concentrate on what the best practices are.
Thank you so much. We're going to do 2 more in under this header before we move on to our next question. The question that we received is, what background requirements are in place for school resource officers, and what kind of training is required before they can be placed in schools?
School resource officers must complete the 40-hour NASRO training, National Association of School Resource Officers. Prior to going to that, what we do here at the Beloit Police Department is we look at people's personnel files, see how they interact with our community, how they interact with children, and then we make the determination after an interview process and a panel discussion if they're going to be SROs for us in our school district. But they must complete the NASRO training prior to going into the intermediate schools and high schools.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And then our last question under this header, have you ever used crisis counselors to de-escalate situations?
In one case, we had, I distinctly remember because I was on scene, we had someone that was experiencing a psychotic break and very paranoid. We were making zero progress. So we did call crisis and had them bring some of their counselors out to the scene. And they had the same struggles that we did. The person just was not in a mental state where any communication was working either way. And then we ultimately physically took him into custody when we went through his apartment door, being concerned that he was hurting somebody inside. No one was hurt, but it did, to me, point out some of the, it's a good tool to have crisis involved in calls like this, but it's often not the perfect solution that sometimes people think that it might be. And that's some of the nuance that we deal with on scenes that that I'd love to talk more about with any of you all to kind of help you understand how that looks.
Thanks to Rock County Human Services, we have a crisis expert embedded in the Janesville Police Department. She works out of the Janesville Police Department. She has a Janesville Police Department radio, and as these calls come in, and she's on our hot sheet, so everybody knows when she's working, when she isn't. And as these calls come in, I can hear the officers asking for this person to also respond to these calls, so we have better outcomes. So that's worked out very well for us. This person also screens all of our reports, and when she's not getting called on calls, she can go and help individuals that suffer from some of these crises on a proactive basis.
Thank you so much. So the next two questions, since they were pretty emphatically answered on our infographic, I'm going to combine them. So for our law enforcement professionals in the meeting, if you could respond to both of these, if you have additional information, and then I'll open it up to the audience. Thank you, audience. You all are coming up with fantastic questions, which doesn't surprise me. So questions 2 and 3, which again, I'll combine. Are chokeholds allowed in your jurisdiction? And also the same for no-knock warrants. Are they allowed in your jurisdiction? So if there's anything beyond what was reported in the infographic that you'd like to add, that would be great.
If you don't mind, I'll jump in real quick. For many of you that don't know me, I'm
several of you who responded also, you cited some policies and you got into some of that, which I think might be helpful. You were quoting from training manuals, et cetera. So if you wanted to expand on that, that might be helpful.
Are you able to hear me?
Could you turn your volume up just a little bit? I don't think Beth heard you talking.
My volume's up as loud as it can go. I'll talk louder. Is that better?
That'd be great. Thank you so much.
For those of you who don't know me, I'm brand new here at Clinton, but prior to Clinton, I came from Winnebago County in Rockford. And as far as chokeholds go, we only allow chokeholds in deadly force situations. The reason for that is back around the turn of the century, 99, 2000, we had sent physical encounter officers for lateral vascular restraint training in Kansas City. They brought back that knowledge, and before we were allowed to use it on the street, we did more research on it and discovered that even though it may safely take care of the problem immediately, the long-term problems from a lateral vascular restraint is very deadly. When, for many of you that don't know it, when your carotid arteries are cut off, plaque in your arteries may break loose and then lodge back in another part of your body or your brain, causing a fatal incident days after the encounter with police. So we never allowed the lateral vascular restraint to be used unless it's deadly force, because it has long-term fatal effects.
Thank you so much for providing those specifics. Are there other law enforcement professionals on the call that would like to add any additional information for chokeholds and or no-knock warrants? And if you're in the audience and you have a question or a concern, a comment, please enter those and I'll review the chat.
Again, from Winnebago County, I was involved in over 100 plus search warrants, narcotic search warrants, homicide search warrants, and I don't recall a time in my 30-year career in Rockford that we ever used a specific no-knock search warrant. So if it is used, it's very rarely used. I just have not personally ever encountered a time where we needed it.
Thank you so much. I am not seeing anything in the chat specific to those two topics. So we will move on to question number 4, which is, what is the policy on the use of military equipment in your jurisdiction?
In Milton, we don't have a policy, nor do we have any military equipment. Since my arrival, we've not participated in those programs, and frankly, the programs have really gone down through the years as well. So we don't have either.
James was the same way. I got 4 ceremonial rifles that you see in parades that don't work. That's the only military equipment. So based on that limited equipment, is not, there's no purpose in writing a policy on it.
Same with the Beloit Police Department.
Thank you so much. Beth, anything in the chat for number 4?
Let's see. I don't think for number 4, but Janet had a question about chokeholds. And that was one she actually asked a little bit early, and so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for catching that. So let's just go back briefly. The question is, in response to chokeholds, when is deadly force authorized?
Well, as one who answered the question that way in a survey, it's a bit of a what if scenario. I guess the one thing that came to mind for me is if an officer has been disarmed and there's a physical fight ongoing and you're fighting over that gun, and you're able to get in a position where you do have somebody in a chokehold that can render them unable to use that weapon against you. I mean, that's one of the scenarios that comes to mind. Basically, we would have to have the authority to take that person's life by any means, whether that's by firearm, rifle, any means at all. We would have to have that authorization before we could use that chokehold.
Okay, and then the last question on this section, what makes the requirement to use a no-knock warrant?
Well, all I can say is you'd have to convince a judge that it's needed, so it'd be based on the circumstances. I don't remember JPD ever using one.
There usually has to be either a safety issue that someone either inside where you're executing that warrant will be harmed if you provide notice, or there has been a history of allowing no-knock warrants for destruction of evidence. But again, no-knock warrants have been becoming more rare over time. And I think law enforcement, at least the ones that I work with, understand the stakes that destroying, doing a no-knock warrant simply upon destruction of evidence standard is less likely. Now we're more focused on the safety issues. And again, in 28 years of my policing, I can think of 2 And those were all based upon the safety of the people inside that place.
Thank you so much. So we're going to move on to question number 5. What is the process for investigating police misconduct? How is data on police misconduct, use of force, and excessive use of force collected?
Yeah, I'm sorry here. I'm trying to work with my cell phone. I wasn't able to get the connection on my computer, so I seem to be a little slow in unmuting myself, so I miss a lot of these answers. Specifically with our use of force training, we've had a program in place since 2002 to really monitor use of force, because we consider that to be such an important duty in the community. So as soon as anybody uses force, and by force I'm talking basically at the level of maybe straightening out somebody's arm and anything higher. So it's a very, very, very low standard for what qualifies as use of force. They have to do a report, and that report spells out a lot of the important stuff about who force is used against, when it is, where it is, what the circumstances were, what they were trying to accomplish, what justifies that use of force. And after they've done a complete report on that, it's reviewed by the first line supervisor, and they may or may not approve it. They may need more information. They may have to work on the report. Then it goes to a lead use of force instructor, and they review it at the time that the incident occurred. And then it's also reviewed by somebody from the administration to all make sure that that force was used correctly. At the end of the year, we also do a summary report on all of the use of forces throughout the course of the year, just to make sure that there aren't any trends that could be a bit of a concern that way. And so you're getting both that individual review and you're getting the trend review, see if maybe one shift is using too much force, or if there's one area that seems to be particularly problematic, and then you can adjust your response and your procedures to try and reduce some of those use of force situations. If we get complaints, we'll follow up on them using an internal investigation procedure. And I can tell you, with this use of force review process in place since 2002, we've had less than one complaint about use of force per year. So I think it's worked out pretty well for us.
Thank you so much for that detailed information. The summary that you collect annually for the use of force, is that available to the public?
Yes, I put that out on our Facebook site shortly after some of the difficulties this summer. So if somebody's interested in it, they can locate it there.
Thank you so much. And our other departments on the call, if you have similar programs or even differing, if you could jump in and let us know what your policies and practices are, and then also how this information is made available to the public, that would be great.
Milton has a very similar process. We collect use of force data on anything beyond presence, dialogue, and then cooperative handcuffing. You know, if we tell somebody that they're under arrest, they voluntarily turn around, put their hands behind their back. We don't collect any data on that, but anything beyond that, all of that is collected, analyzed, and then we also publish it as part of our annual report every year.
James was very similar with the practices, although we send a supervisor on scene immediately. That supervisor is required to start that investigation immediately. He meets with the person that was affected, takes photographs, interviews any witnesses, and we lock down as much information as we can immediately, and then that plays into the ongoing investigation. Yeah, release of information. I think it's in my annual report, but I do need to check on that. I know our citizen complaints are in there and internal investigations. I just need to see if our use of force is also in there.
Thank you so much. We have a couple questions in the chat I want to make sure that I get to. Kelly Mattingly has a question. Kelly, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask, please.
Thanks. It actually, can you hear me okay?
We can.
These are new laptops at our office and we've been having trouble with them. So it really goes back to the no-knock issues. And I think what we're hearing tonight is that law enforcement really can't remember any no-knocks being used. I've been doing criminal defense for 35 years, so I can remember them. But I will agree with law enforcement that lately they really just have not been being used. And I'm wondering if, given that they're not being used, they're not being asked for by law enforcement, and there doesn't seem to be a need for them, whether law enforcement would see a need for them, and whether they would believe that if we simply got rid of no-knock warrants, at least in our jurisdiction, whether they would miss them.
Thank you.
You know, Kelly, about the time we decide that we would never need them and say that we'll never use them is about the time we're probably going to need one. I don't see the need for drug warrants, but if there was a kidnapping or the like, and where the safety is so high for that individual, there could be that very, very small circumstance where it would be appropriate. I just changed our I'm in the process of changing our policy. Not only does a judge need to sign off on a no-knock search warrant, it has to be vetted by a deputy chief before we would allow it. So we're really taking a close look. And Kelly, I agree with you too. You just don't hear of them anymore. I think people realize the inherent risk with those warrants are just so great that we don't use them.
And Chief, I get what you're saying about the situation you're talking about, where it might be a kidnapping situation, someone's in imminent danger. I get that, but I guess I was really only thinking in terms of drug investigations, because that's really the only place I've ever seen no-knock warrants being used in Rock County. So do we need them in drug cases anymore?
Yeah, I don't think you're going to see them in my jurisdiction. I certainly can't speak for others. That'd be, I think I could support that, if there were a state rule on that, if they were going to cut out not for the use of drug warrants. But again, the kidnappings, the safety issues, there may be a very small area there that they would be effective.
Thank you so much. Go ahead.
Just quickly, I think you're also seeing a shift in the industry away from willy-nilly deciding to kick someone's door in. We are much more judicious now, both for the safety of the people inside that residence and for our own safety. Can we come up with other options so that we maybe take the person into custody outside and then, hey, here's this warrant, we're going to search your house. And then we aren't having those confrontations inside of a residence. The years of us doing warrant after warrant when we enter somebody's house with people inside it, at least in my experience, I'm reluctant to do those. And we try to come up with other options to get into that house without creating that confrontation.
Thank you so much. So one more question in this section before we move on. What is your gut reaction to the death of Breonna Taylor because of the no-knock warrant policy?
I think for me, that points out to just what I said. You are creating a situation inside somebody's residence where they may not know what's happening. And all of those things come into play, whether it's a no-knock warrant, whether it's time of day, whether it's appropriate of the announcing, all sorts of factors go into that. And are we setting ourselves up for a use of force by us or by the person who is frankly scared to death and is reacting to that? Avoiding those situations as a whole when we can, I think, is appropriate. So that was my reaction when I first heard it.
Thank you. Anyone else from law enforcement would like to respond? All right, that was my 5-second teacher wait time. So before we go to question 6, which is about qualified immunity, I just wanted to read a little bit of information, and then I will drop a link in the chat. And one thing that I appreciate about this link is that it gives illustrative case law in chronological order from 1982 until 2002. So I'll just read this briefly. Qualified immunity is a type of legal immunity. Qualified immunity balances 2 important interests: the need to hold public officials accountable when they exercise power irresponsibly, and the need to shield officials from harassment, distraction, and liability when they perform their duties reasonably. And that's Pearson versus Callahan. Specifically, qualified immunity protects a government official from lawsuits alleging that the official violated a plaintiff's rights, only allowing suits where officials violated a clearly established statutory or constitutional right. When determining whether or not a right was clearly established, courts consider whether a hypothetical reasonable official would have known that the defendant's conduct violated the plaintiff's rights. Courts conducting this analysis apply the law that was in force at the time of the alleged violation, not the law in effect when the courts consider the case. Qualified immunity is not immunity from having to pay money or damages, but rather immunity from having to go through the cost of a trial. Accordingly, courts must resolve qualified immunity issues as early in the case as possible, sometimes preferably before discovery. Qualified immunity only applies to suits against government officials as individuals, not suits against the government for damages caused by the official's actions. Although qualified immunity frequently appears in cases involving police officers, it also applies to most other executive branch officials. While judges, prosecutors, legislators, and some other government officials do not receive qualified immunity, most are protected by other immunity doctrines. So with that being said, and I'll get that link in just a minute, what is your position on eliminating qualified immunity?
Well, I'll go again. My answer was no to elimination, but I think it's something that deserves looking at. There's been one of the things that I subscribe to is a monthly digest of law enforcement liability court cases. And there have been court cases that I've read about where qualified immunity attaches to that case, and I can't believe that it did. Really egregious examples of either harm done to an individual or to their property, and a judge determines that no established right has been violated. And there are times that I'm shocked by that. And if I'm shocked by that, I think members of the public are as well. So I'm a no. I think qualified immunity serves a purpose. We should have somewhat of a shield is not the right word, but somewhat of a protection for a police officer making discretionary decisions in seconds. That with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, we then try to evaluate in a courtroom. So there is an advantage to have some sort of immunity protection. I do think it needs to be looked at. That's my personal opinion. I think the original intent, the pendulum has swung a little bit too far. And I think we need to spend a little bit of time analyzing that.
Thank you so much. Anyone else from law enforcement that would like to add to the discussion on qualified immunity?
I said no, as far as eliminating it. I think it's a thing where a discussion needs to be had and figuring out the proper terms in regards to what law enforcement officers are doing. If the officer can be deemed to not have malice intent behind what they're doing and they're doing it for the right reason to protect themselves or protect others, then they should be covered by something, because we go out on a daily basis and we do things that some do not want to do. And I think if we eliminate this, we're going to lose a lot of great officers in our rank and file. But it's something that we should be having a discussion about. But at the same time, just to throw it away because some of the unfortunate situations that have occurred in law enforcement is something that we shouldn't do. But we should open it up, look at it, and have a real debate about it. And I don't want to call it a debate, but have a discussion about it and look at some of the things that we can do to correct some of that.
Thank you. Okay, so I do have a question that came in. If you think qualified immunity should stay, what more can be done to hold police accountable? It seems that the current process in many jurisdictions results in police policing police internally.
Hey, I think I got in there. I was thinking here recently with officer-involved shootings, I think at the state level, they decided that they should put some provisions in place where they mandate that it's not the local jurisdiction investigating themselves in those types of circumstances. So I think pretty much across the board, it may not be 100%, but very close to that. Everybody is using the Department of Justice, and they come in as an outside entity and do that investigation. I think that makes it a little more objective, and that's, I guess, an example of an area where we've stepped in that direction, maybe short of taking away qualified immunity.
Thank you so much. And that segues into our next question. Are there plans to further discuss the update and update the policy of qualified immunity?
Well, qualified immunity is not a policy, it's a legal doctrine. So that's work that would need to be done at the legislative and the court level. If there's going to be any adjustments in that, there's nothing that we can do at a policy level within a police department to impact that.
So as law enforcement, are there conversations going on within your departments concerning qualified immunity?
I don't know that an individual officer spends any time specifically thinking about it, other than kind of what Andre brought up. It's now come to the forefront with the cries for complete elimination of it. So even at the officer level, they've probably spent no time thinking about it until now. And then looking at it from that perspective that, I can't do this job and get sued for every single thing that I do during my shift. So I don't know that we as a department don't really discuss it, but we're interested to see where the conversation goes.
Thank you so much. So we're going to move on to our next question, which is, in what way can community members have consistent input in how we as citizens participate in public safety?
I know over the last couple of years, City of Beloit, we've had our conversations with the community where we wrote out some of our use of force policies. We went over those policies, traffic stops, how a person should act during a traffic stop. I think the biggest thing is getting people in the community to show up at these conversations. I think over the last 4 years, I believe we've had anywhere between 12 and 16 meetings, and I probably can count on both hands how many people have shown up. And when I look into the crowd, it's the older generation, the mid 40s, the 50s, the 60s. And it's a thing of how do we get the 20s, the teenagers, the 30-year-olds to come to these meetings to understand where we're coming from They can get firsthand knowledge of what we're talking about, what our policies are, and how you are supposed to act on traffic stops. Our most recent one back in, I believe it was February of this year, I was excited to see about 5 or 6 teenage kids in the crowd. So I went over and talked to them afterwards, and I said, hey, thanks for coming out. Did you see this on Facebook? Did you see this on social media? No, I'm in this class, and my teacher said to get extra credit, I need to come to this meeting. So it's not like they came because they wanted to learn about traffic stops or use of force. They came because they wanted to get the extra credit. And I think growing up where I grew up in Aurora, Illinois, and having contacts with the police because of the neighborhood I lived in, I didn't understand laws. And I think if people get out and they want to understand their rights, and it's coming from the police that's in your city, it will help a lot. So I think just getting people to come out and talk to us. I know we're not the most liked people in the world, but I think it has to be a 50-50. If we're out and we're willing to speak with you and let us know what's going on, it will help our relationship with our community better. And I think it has to be 50-50. And I think we're getting there as a law enforcement agencies, but we just need that community buy-in now to come in and talk with us and let us know what's going on.
Are there any plans or discussions? And I know that COVID-19 makes this more challenging, but to go to where the people are. So you go into the classroom, whether that's via Zoom or in person, or you ask schools to have an assembly or go to community meetings where community members are already naturally gathering, and ask if you can present. That may be an inroads to get your message out to more community members. Are those plans or conversations or discussions happening in your departments?
They happen. I know we went to the Merrill neighborhood, the Hackett neighborhood, and we did things like that. I know over the last couple of years, I took it upon myself to go out to the Beloit Learning Academy. I spend 2.5 to 3 hours out of my day, and I'm not saying it in a demeaning way, but I would spend time going and meeting with our young people in the community and explain why you need a driver license and why we can stop you for this violation, for they have that understanding. I broke it off at the high school level just because the understanding, and they're getting to the age where they're going to be driving and they're going to have contacts with the police. So, and this is just me, but we've been going and getting out in the community, and I'm always willing to come out and do that. I think I just need to know where these meetings are held at and when they're on the Zooms, and I don't think we have a problem with putting ourselves out there and going to these meetings.
Similarly, Janesville has an African-American liaison advisory committee, a Latino liaison advisory committee. I'd urge you to join those. Simply contact the department and we can associate you with those groups. One of the most effective things we've had in Janesville is we do these small group block parties, for lack of a better term, small group outings, SNGs. And what we've learned is when we did like National Night Out, we'd have 3,000 people down to the police department, but we really weren't making relationships like we wanted. So what we do in the summertime, and COVID has affected this, we'll pick out a 2 or 3 or 4 block area in neighborhoods where people don't trust the police. And we'll invite just those neighbors around that area. And we'll block off the street and we'll bring in food and games for the kids. But we've had great success in building trust, good success in having those dialogues as to what's going on in your neighborhood and why police do things the way that they do. And we'll do about 6 or 7 of those a summer, but that's been real effective with us for building trust and making those connections with really those people that don't trust us.
Thank you so much, Chief Moore. Captain Sales, thank you. And I can definitely attest to the time that you spend in the community. I don't know if you remember this or not, but a couple years ago, you helped me with a self-defense class at BLA, which I know is very impactful for the students there. So thank you again for that. We're going to go on to our next question. And Chief Moore, if you could drop the contact of whoever we can get in touch with for community members that are interested in serving on the committee you just referenced. That would be great if you could place that in the chat. Our next question is, do you believe the culture of law enforcement needs to change at a local, state, and national level? And why or why not? And that's open to our law enforcement professionals on the call.
So I'm personally a relationship guy. That's why I participate in these events, so that even though it's over Zoom, we can hear from one another what our lived experiences are and learn from one another adjustments that might be able to be made. I think, not to get too philosophical, but we are getting to a point where we are only driving one another apart from each other in a variety of different ways, and we can't afford to do the work that we do, being integrally involved in the community and not be willing to have a conversation with each other and try to come to some understanding. So that's my personal belief and philosophy, that we don't reach understanding at all if we don't talk. And culturally, I don't know that every department does that. I think we very much believe that here in Rock County. And I feel very lucky to work with the partners that I do.
Thank you so much. In the interest of time, we are going to head to the question. And again, this was mainly addressed in that fantastic infographic. But does your department have body cameras? So we know the answer to that. So the second two parts of that are, if yes, what are the requirements for the use of those devices? And then I know at the county, there are plans to get body cameras. And the question is, if no, is there a plan to acquire body cameras? So if that grant doesn't go through, is there a plan B or C? So the first question, for all of the jurisdictions that do have the body cameras, what are the requirements for the use? Are they required to be on? What are the policies and practices around the body cameras?
We expect our officers to have them on if there's any anticipated police action. And that is quite encompassing, and that's our expectations. We review the body cameras with some frequency, and the officers seem to do very well with getting those cameras on.
Thank you. Are there any differing criteria?
We don't have any different criteria. It's the same thing. You believe there's going to be a call for service, you're to have your body camera on. So basically, if they've been doing a business check, we require them to have that body camera on. We get CAD numbers, so therefore we can identify calls that we go to. If they are not just testing the body camera, then they upload all of their body camera footage at the end of the shift, and we do quarterly checks on our body cameras to assure that people are turning their body cameras on when they need to, checking the functionality of the body camera, because it is a technology piece and it could stop and we may not know that, but we do audit checks on it quarterly to make sure the body cameras are up and functioning and they're doing what they're supposed to do to catch the good things that our cops are doing, and also unfortunately sometimes catch some of the things that they're not supposed to be doing.
Thank you. I see some activity in the chat, so let me jump over there. A couple questions I'll try to combine. The first is, why are officers allowed to turn them on and off during stops? So if that is the case, if you could speak to that. And then the second question, can you discuss how you address discretion with young officers when not responding to calls for service and just keeping an eye out for traffic violations? What plates do you run? Who do you pull over? What questions do you ask when speaking with a driver? The exercise of discretion is so integral to our law enforcement system, but also ripe for abuse. So if you, if someone on the call from law enforcement could field either of those two questions. Again, the first was, why are officers allowed to turn them, meaning body cameras, on and off? If that is the case, please respond.
With our policy, sometimes we're discussing tactical things that we're going to do. So we don't want to give away our tactics that we utilize on a daily basis. So if a person turns off their body camera, if an officer turns off their body camera, they must speak into the camera and say why they're turning the body camera off. It's our policy, they have to say that. So that's why sometimes they turn the cameras on and off, but they have to give an explanation of why they're turning the body cameras off.
And then the traffic stop question, how do you run plates? When do you pull people over? What questions do you ask when speaking with drivers?
I think a lot of that is part of our training process. When we get new officers, you know, those that have never been in the field before are 720 hours of academy training, and then we take another 12 weeks to teach them the nuances of how to police within our community. And a part of that is, you know, walking them through those discretionary acts. And your question, the comment is correct. It is a broad thing, and that's one of the ways that law enforcement can be complicated. And we ask a lot of these young officers, especially, and so we do our best through training and supervision to try to mold them into how we police in our individual jurisdictions, and it's hard work.
Thank you. And then just to drill down on one of the last question, when are officers allowed to turn off their body cameras? So Captain Sales, I know you said that if they're going to turn it off, they have to give a reason. When is a justified reason to turn off your body cameras, and what are some of those reasons?
When an officer is obviously going into the police department and they may be going to the restroom, turn off their body camera, discussing tactics once again. After a call for service has been completed, they're to turn off their body camera. The battery life on the cameras, you can get some days anywhere between 12 and 14 hours. City of Beloit, we work 10-hour shifts. So it's about maximizing the battery life. And when a call for service is over, that's when they turn the body camera off. There's videos here where they're 2, 3, 4 hours long because the call for service took that long. So they are to keep their body camera on the entire duration of that call for service. Unless they're at the police department, they're booking somebody and they have to go to once again, the restroom. Turn your body camera off. We have signs posted outside of our men's and women's restroom. Did you turn your body camera off? And then when they exit out of there, did you turn your body camera on? So giving them the clues and those things to help them out to turn them off and turn them back on. But those are some of the things that we require and ask our officers to do.
Thank you so much. All right, we're winding down. One of our final questions, what role does funding play in regards to the questions that we've covered? And I know part of that information was provided in our infographic, but if you have any additions, I know some of the responses were staffing or training, or in some cases both. If you have any additional information to that you would like to share, that would be great.
Maybe I can just speak quickly too. I said, ask me about the jail and my response there. You know, some of the things that we hope to accomplish definitely have some great big price tags attached to them. I've been watching a number of videos from different types of facilities around the country and how they, and around the world, how they address issues of rehabilitation and corrections and that sort of thing. And when I looked with some of those facilities at the number of staff, I mean, it was just amazing the amount of staff and the ratio of staff to inmates, and far exceeds what we have. And of course, these are funding issues. You know, I think with a lot of things, with you know, the body cams we just got done talking about, those are very expensive items. Not so much that the cameras are so expensive, but my understanding is the storage is so expensive. And that's why we really push to try and get some of those funds through grants. And hopefully we'll find out about that relatively soon. But, you know, I think certainly with law enforcement, if you have more money, there's certainly always more that you can do. And sometimes we have to try and get by with what we have. And maybe that's why it's taken a while to get body cams at the county level, but hopefully we'll be able to rectify that relatively soon. And as we look towards what's the future of our correctional facility, I think we're going to have to take a look at that funding piece of it. You know, I think if we want to continue to do what we've always done, and I think they said around the country, recidivism after 9 years is pushing 80% in the United States. And I think if we're satisfied with that, well, then we continue to try and get by with the bare minimum here. But if we really want to make an improvement in the way that we handle these sorts of things, I think we're going to have to invest in it.
Thank you so much. So actually 2 questions that were emailed to me. I'll share those now for law enforcement. The first is, how does your department work with Immigrations, Customs, and Enforcement, so ICE? And would your department consider putting an end to any collaborative efforts with ICE?
I think it's.
I guess in Milton, we've never been asked. I have never worked with an ICE official, so I guess we've had no contact.
Captain Sales, you had something you wanted to add?
I was going to say, I think it's been about, 3 or 4 years since we've had a working, I don't say a working relationship, but any situation where we assisted ICE for things. And I think that was a high profile case that they were looking for a gentleman that left and he needed to be found. So that's been 3 or 4 years. Sometimes it's a call, say, hey, we're here, this is what we're doing. And it's not a, do you want to help us type of deal. It's, this is what we're doing and this is what we're going to go and do. We just want to give the courtesy to let you know this, we were in your area.
Thank you. And then the second question that was emailed to me, what is your department's enforcement of operating a vehicle without a driver's license, with special emphasis on immigrant communities?
I didn't fully hear the question. Sorry.
Oh, okay, let me repeat. What is your department's enforcement policies for operating a vehicle without a driver's license? And then they added, with special emphasis on immigrant communities.
I can't think of a time where we went out and just targeted people that may be immigrants to see if they had driver's license or not. It's during a normal routine traffic stop, you may identify a person that is operating without a driver's license, and just like anybody else, unfortunately, you know, you have to write those citations. The biggest thing is getting linked up with communities, groups that have, I'll just say Spanish speaking or any other group, to assist those individuals to understand that there's ways to go and get their driver's license and help them out with it.
So that is information that's provided. If you recognize that a person does not have a driver's license, I understand you may have to write that citation or give a warning, but you also provide resources to how a driver's license can be obtained.
We have the Latino Coalition group here in Beloit, and I think the last time we met was early spring, and that's something that we had put on the table. Obviously with COVID, We haven't been able to reapproach that yet because I think our first meeting is either the end of this week or next week sometime.
Thank you. Any other departments would like to provide information on those last two questions?
We have a few, a small Hispanic community here in Clinton. If they don't have a valid license and an officer stops them, more often than not, they'll provide them with a written warning and also advise them of the resources available to get their license valid. So we'll put them in the right direction to get a valid license so that they don't run into the same problem over and over.
Thank you so much. So as I went back to the chat, there are a couple questions. So we're going to go back just a little bit because we have, we have a couple minutes. So I'll see how many I can get through. Is there a way to get rid of the 30-second delay before the camera, and this is body cameras, pick up the volume? It ends up missing the very start of the interaction, which is often very important.
Well, the 30-second delay in some devices, it's not in every device, is supposed to pick up the 30 seconds before the interaction even occurs. So when there's things that are picked up in that 30-second, they call it pre-event. And so if I activate my body camera, the software and the memory inside that camera makes as part of the recording the 30 seconds before I turned it on. And because of the limitations of the technology, you have video, but you don't have audio. That's specifically designed to pick up kind of those early things that might have happened before I hit the on button. Getting rid of it isn't an option. I think it's better than not having it because you are capturing more than you would otherwise. But understanding what that 30 seconds of no audio actually means, I don't think we've been very good at explaining that.
Thank you so much. So in the last couple minutes that we have, first off, in the start of our discussion, Chief Moore, I referred to you by your first and last name only without a title. So my apologies for that, Chief Moore, please forgive me. Thank you so much for law enforcement that joined us, for our community who joined in. You have provided amazing questions. Hopefully we got a lot of those questions answered in a way that satisfied you. Beth and Neil have given me permission to do a shameless plug for the YWCA. So without further ado, that is what I am going to do. I will share my screen. So we have a few events coming up. The first is YWCA Rock County Fall Lunch and Learn. We are honored to have Dr. Lisa Anderson-Levy, who will be discussing the urgency of learning to talk about race. That is going to be this Thursday from noon until 1. You can visit our website right there at the bottom, ywcarockcounty.org, to register. It is free and open to the public. Again, so we're hopeful that you can join us. As many of you know, our Racial Justice Conference is coming up on November 12th from 8:30 a.m. to 3 p.m. We are handling registration for our sponsors right now, but general registration will be opening soon. Again, you can find more information on our website, but specifically I wanted to let you know about the Dorothy Height Diversity in the Workplace Award. Please visit our website to get the criteria. The deadline has been extended to October 15th. So it's for businesses that are located in Rock County and that show a commitment to cultural diversity. So please check us out and support our Fall Lunch and Learn, our Racial Justice Conference on November 12th. And then keep in mind, if you are a business or an organization that qualifies for the prestigious Dorothy Height Award, please make sure you get your applications in. Neil and Beth, we are right at 7 o'clock. Before we enter the parking lot and I end recording, are there any other announcements you need to share with the group?
Well, you got to make your announcement about the YWCA, so I'm going to say that on the 15th of October at 6:30 is the Diversity Action Team monthly meeting, and it's by Zoom, and you can go to the Diversity Action Team of Rock County Facebook page or website and register for that. I also want to say to anybody who's on the call that if you want to be on the email list, please write your email in the chat box and I will copy it and put you on the list.
Beth, any announcements for community action?
Yes, if you have not seen our Everyday Racism video, it is fantastic. It's a production we did with Dry Water Productions, and it is on our website in our diversity and inclusion page. Since I am a visual learner, I like to see things written out. And so I've already posted the full answers from law enforcement that you submitted before the event. Thank you so much for submitting those. And then you'll be able to see also that while an infographic is good to look at, especially on social media, a lot of times these questions don't have yes or no answers. So the full answers are posted on the Community Action website. It's under the Courageous Conversations page, which I believe is under Outreach. So you can find it there. And also Community Action is very pleased to be hosting an Indigenous Peoples Day celebration, commemoration, and October 12th. And that's at 11 a.m. at the Eclipse Center. I believe it's going to be pretty casual. So we are having Mr. William Gran, who I believe is still on this call. He is going to have a ceremony for us, so it should be pretty meaningful. We're excited about it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I am going to end recording.